President Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran last night, but shortly after, both countries accused each other of violating the terms of the agreement. Those terms, by the way, are still very unclear. But the rockets flying drew the anger of President Trump this morning, who called out both countries, telling them to hold their fire. It demonstrates just how fragile this ceasefire actually is. Meanwhile, a NATO summit is being held in the Netherlands today and tomorrow, where our allies, together with President Trump, will discuss their defense spending and how they'll prepare for the impact of the U.S. strikes on Iran. Meanwhile, at home, the Trump administration has postponed two separate intelligence briefings scheduled for today with all members of the House and the Senate. Top aides to the president were scheduled to hold those briefings, including National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and the Joint Chiefs Chair Dan Kane. Now, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has called the postponement outrageous, evasive, and derelict. So to say there are many questions still hanging in the balance is an understatement. Michael Boyle, Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University, sat down with us earlier today to help once again explain the nuance of all that's happened so far. Michael, so great to have you back with us today. Obviously, we know a lot more, and a lot has changed even since we spoke to you yesterday. First, we see the president come out last night with this announcement that there was a ceasefire. What, if anything, do we know about the terms of that deal?
We know very little about the terms of the deal, other than it was negotiated in part with Qatar and in part with a kind of back channel to the Iranians to get them to agree. The substantive terms of what it actually means when we say we have a ceasefire is really unclear. As a matter of fact, the White House announcement came out before either party acknowledged there was a ceasefire. Now they have subsequently done so. So I think one of the things I would be worried about with the ceasefire is that President Trump clearly wants an end to the war. The question is, the devil is in the details. So what are the terms of the ceasefire? For example, is Israel allowed to strike back against an Iranian proxy like the Houthis? What happens if there are terrorist attacks elsewhere that are potentially attributed to Iran? Is that sort of seen as a resumption of the war? So there are some real specific sticky questions that I don't think we have an answer to yet, simply because the president announced it with almost no detail.
Also, as you said, this feels pretty fragile. We already saw both sides accuse the other of violating the terms. We know that there were missiles fired from both sides after there was this announcement from the president. How tricky is it to ensure that this continues in the days and the weeks to come?
I think it would be advantageous to think about whether there's some external party like the UN, for example, that might be able to kind of mediate in the ceasefire agreement and ensure a degree of compliance, because at this point the U.S. wouldn't be trusted to do so. I mean, what we saw immediately was that there were missiles launched from Iran into Israel, but then Israel actually continued a fairly heavy bombardment of Tehran overnight. And in part, what that was trying to do was create facts on the ground. They knew that there was a 12-hour window between the announcement of the ceasefire and it taking effect. So what they wanted to do essentially was to destroy as many missile launchers as they could, some of the military command and control infrastructure, and weaken Iranian capacity before the ceasefire takes into effect. The problem with it is that when you have a tenuous ceasefire, that sort of action looks provocative. And that's why President Trump was so angry this morning, saying essentially that both of them need to knock it off. But this is sort of built into a ceasefire. If you give me 12 more hours to fight, both sides are going to continue to take their last shots until the very end. And certainly Iran doesn't want to look weak, given that it was pretty decisively beaten in the context of this 12-day war.
Do you believe there is a real path to diplomacy with the U.S. involved, given that Iran has already said they don't trust the U.S. right now because we fired on them in the midst of negotiations? Is there a clear path to diplomacy here?
There is a path, but it's not an easy path. So Iran has actually signaled that they're willing to go to Geneva under European auspices and talk to the United States kind of behind closed doors. It's worth pointing out the U.S. and Iran, without formal diplomatic recognition, don't directly speak, so they speak through intermediaries. It's not clear to me that they would be willing to give a lot of concessions to the United States or to Israel in the position that they're in. I mean, they've just been basically defeated in the war. Their military infrastructure is weak, and it's politically costly for them to give a lot to Israel after Israel just beat them in the war. So it's not clear to me that there is a very sort of obvious path to diplomacy. I think the White House is hoping that this is essentially close to a sucker punch, right? That Israel hits Iran so hard that Iran essentially throws up its hands and says, no more nuclear weapons, that's it. We would like to have a new path forward. Certainly that's what the White House wants. It's not clear to me that a weakened regime that has been damaged as badly as they have been damaged and is a threat from their own people from an uprising is going to simply then give in to fairly generous terms to Israel or to the United States. So I would imagine they're going to keep talking in Geneva, but I wouldn't bet the farm that there's going to be a lot coming from it.
We know that the White House was scheduled to have an intelligence briefing with both members, all members of the Senate, as well as the House. Those have both been postponed. It's gotten a lot of pushback from Democratic lawmakers. What typically comes out of those intelligence briefings? What do we learn, especially about what, came of the attack?
So there's been a decay in the degree to which presidents of both parties have been willing to brief Congress for national security issues. This is not unusual, though. In this case, I think the Trump administration is taking it even one step further than previous administrations have done. There is a real problem we have in this country about sort of the designation of war powers. To what extent should Congress be read in on an operation like this? Normally, after an attack like this, the United States executive branch has to read out to the members of Congress at least some basically military technical details. Now, when you get to the question about what is left with Iran's nuclear weapons program, that is kind of high military, and that is read into the Gang of Eight in the Congress, but not to your average rank and file member of the Congress. So there will be a briefing with a degree of information that's provided, but everything you provide to the Congress, you have to assume will be leaked, right? So the most sensitive stuff is going to be reserved for a much smaller briefing. To me, the interesting question is going to be whether the Trump administration decides to follow that in any meaningful way. In other words, do they give any substantive information to the Congress? And secondly, what the Democrats choose to do with it, because the Democrats are now mobilizing around concerns about sort of reinvigoration of the War Powers Act to stop presidents from simply doing what President Trump did, which was bombing without an authorization of war, and then more or less denying congressional scrutiny from it.
Yeah, there's a lot that we're going to continue to follow, including where we go from here and whether or not Iran has the capability to rebuild any of their nuclear capabilities that were attacked. But Michael Boyle, thank you as always for such great insight.
Thank you.